All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I am Kim Jackson. I am the Director of Advising and Scholar Support for the Lenfest Scholars Foundation, which is a community-based organization in rural parts of Pennsylvania, and we help kids through college. We are going to have a panel discussion this morning about test optional admission. So I'm just going to do kind of a quick overview, and then we'll have our panelists introduce themselves and I will ask some questions, and then we will open it up for the group to ask questions. So if anything comes up during our talk, please feel free to put a question in the chat. All right, so the debate about the role of standardized testing in college admissions is not a new subject for us, right? Um, Although many selective universities have traditionally required SAT and ACT scores as part of the admissions process, in the past decade, some schools have kind of pulled back from requiring those scores. And we all remember during COVID, during the pandemic, when testing centers were closed and students couldn't take the test, they were unable to take the test. So in the past couple of years, some selective institutions have kind of reinstated the requirement to submit test scores as part of their application process. And other schools have maintained their test-free or test-optional policies. So just going to go through a couple of terms so that everybody's clear. I don't assume, let me let these people in. I don't assume that everybody knows all the terminology. So I would test optional is when students are not required to submit their test scores, but if they do, those scores will be considered in the admissions decision. Some schools are what's called test flexible. So standardized test scores are required, but there's some flexibility in what kinds of scores the students can submit. So like AP or IB scores in place of SATs or ACTs. And then there are test blind institutions, and those are schools where test scores are not considered as part of the application process for any student. The rationale behind test optional admissions policy, some people kind of question the role of standardized test scores in college admissions, arguing that scores reflect a student's access to resources. So if students have more access to test preparation and tutoring, the process favors students from more affluent backgrounds. Proponents of test blind or test optional admissions also argue that the testing requirement itself can pose a barrier to students from disadvantaged backgrounds who may not have access to testing centers or who may not understand how to navigate the testing system. Furthermore, standardized test scores have been shown to be correlated with demographic factors such as race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status, raising some concerns that test scores are not really a fair and unbiased representation of a student's academic strengths and potential. Test optional admissions, in theory, allow a student more flexibility in presenting their strengths in preparation for college coursework. Students can use test scores to demonstrate academic strengths, but can also use other tools to showcase their accomplishments and academic potential. For example, showcasing their written communication skills through essays or other written elements of the application, descriptions of their extracurricular activities, involvements, et cetera. And I think this is particularly true for students from rural backgrounds that may have not have the same kinds of access to rigorous academic coursework or curriculum. So, it's a kind of a tricky situation to talk about whether or not students are going to submit test scores sometimes, or whether or not that's something that they really need to showcase their academic strengths. So, we are going to have our panelists introduce themselves, describe their institution's policy on the use of standardized test scores and admission, and then I'll throw them some questions. All right, do you want to start with you, Janet?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Janet Barkdahl. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an admissions counselor at Swarthmore College, just outside of Philadelphia. We are in Swarthmore, PA. We're about 1,700 students, undergrad only, liberal arts with engineering. Um, we are test optional in our admissions process. So we read about, I would say on average in the last 5 years since we've gone test optional at the start of the pandemic, but we've kept that. Approximately 50%, it varies year to year, of our students will submit testing and approximately 50% won't. Megan, do you want to go next?
Sure. And I'm on our NACAC leadership, ROLSIG leadership board. I am the director of regional recruitment for Kent State University. We are a regional public university in Northeast Ohio. We are test optional. Our Kent campus, I like to say we don't have a campus in Maine. It's in Kent, Ohio. That campus we are test optional as well. We do have some programs that I will say, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, where they have test score requirements within the programs for placement and entrance. And then we also have regional campuses throughout Northeast Ohio, which are open admission and have no test score requirements whatsoever. I'm going to pass it along to Alex.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Alex Landon. I'm the Senior Associate Director of Admissions at Michigan State University. Michigan State University is a large public comprehensive Research One institution located in East Lansing, Michigan. We have about 50,000 students on our campus. So we definitely are one of the larger institutions actually across the country. And our policy currently is that we are utilizing test optional. We allow the student to declare on their application whether or not they'd like to have their test scores considered, and we operate within the wishes of the student. So if the student tells us to consider their test scores as part of their application, we will. And if they say no, we'll ignore them. And when I say we'll ignore them, we do say that even if a student sends us a test score, but they have asked us not to consider it, we still do not consider it because they have asked us not to. One of the reasons I love to point that out to folks is because we often get questions from students about doing the automatic score sends during the tests and whether or not they should do that before they review their scores. And for us at Michigan State, we will tell students, go ahead and send them to us because it's an opportunity to get them to us quickly. But if you tell us on your application you do not want us to consider them, we won't, even if we have them in hand. So that is part of our policy. As far as the rest of the institution goes, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about this, we do have some scholarships and programs that do continue to look at test scores, but for the most part, most of our institution does observe the test optional policy, and we can get into that a little bit later.
All right, I think Alex, you've kind of answered this question a little bit already, but my first question is, when students submit test scores to test optional schools, how are those scores evaluated in the admissions process?
Definitely. I obviously talked a little bit about that right there, but I do think that there are multiple ways. And when students do submit their test scores, I think it's important that they're discussing with their admissions counselor what the consideration of those scores looks like for every institution. So I think that even when schools are test optional, and for me, I think one of the things that made test optional difficult for students was that even though we all used that term, we applied that term differently across our admissions processes and what it actually meant for the student. So I often will encourage students to ask that question about, for example, should I send my scores before I've seen them? For example, at Michigan State, we're going to put it completely in your hands about whether or not you want us to look at that. But there are institutions that if they have the score on hand, they're going to assume that you want them to look at it. So I think it's really important to understand the way that the institution is going to do it. There are other institutions that I consider under what I would refer to as a do no harm policy, which also would suggest that they say we only use the score if it helps the student. So regardless of whether or not we have it, and they refer to themselves as test optional, but they use it in a very specific way. The biggest piece of advice I can give when it comes to students navigating how their scores will be utilized in the process is to truly not be afraid to ask the question of their admissions counselors and really understand, what do they do with my score if I send it to them? Do I have an option to make that decision myself, or is it based on whether or not I send the score? Because I think that's a fundamental difference in those processes.
I can add a little bit. Swarthmore operates actually identically to Michigan State, where if a student elects on their application whether or not they'd like us to use their score, and if they answer no, we don't use it, even if it's on someone's transcript, which we often will see test scores on transcripts, or we'll see prior scores, even if they've taken it multiple times. And I think as we're evaluating applications, for me, that test score comes in. If I have it, it becomes a part of that conversation in the academic section. So we're looking at a student's transcript. Swarthmore and liberal arts colleges in general might read in more of a holistic admissions approach. So we're considering in your overall decision, your academics, your activities list, your recommendation letters, everything you do. There's no one piece in that that's going to be the reason you're admitted or the reason you're denied, or the reason for your whole decision. We're really looking at a combination of factors. So as I consider the academic portion of that evaluation, we're considering not just the grades a student has in their transcript, but the curriculum they chose to take, the level of rigor of those courses, based on what is offered in their high school. And so a test score can be helpful to us, and we also read it in context as often as we can, whether that's looking at an average SAT range for that high school, from College Board or from a school profile, and any other information we have to kind of place that score in context.
And if I could just add on, Kim, if you don't mind, I think that's a fantastic point that Janet makes as well, because we similarly do what we refer to as read students against their peers. So we want to make sure that we are taking a student's application within its context. So we will be paying attention to where that application comes from and what those SAT scores are going to look like, not only in comparison to the entirety of our application pool, but within a region, even down to within a school or a district, because we do want to make sure that we're considering where that SAT comes from and what those resources within that district may look like and how they have an impact on the student's scores as well. That's a really fantastic point to make sure is in there.
I think it's also important to note, at least what we do too, is though if a student says they want to provide test scores, that will stop their application from becoming complete until they are submitted. Now, as we head into, well, we'll say it's June now, it's not spring, but let's just pretend we were talking in December. If we had a student that, especially as we head into scholarship time and stuff, that still hasn't submitted test scores and they've been pending for more than 30 days, and we know that there's been test dates, we will then review that student without those scores if they are not, especially if we look at that student and say holistically they're probably going to get in. Like, so that is something that we will do, so a student just isn't hanging out there waiting on test scores, because some students underplace themselves when they apply. Like, they think they need them to get in and they really don't. I don't know if any other Alex or Janet, that happens with you as well, but especially December through May timeframe, we don't want that test score to be a barrier, because a student might have decided in August they needed it, but they actually don't.
All right, next question. And the question is, under what circumstances does it benefit a student to submit test scores? And under what circumstances might it hurt their chances? And I kind of interpret this question as looking at what scores, because one of the things that is always a tricky question with students is, should I submit? Because I usually tell students, some schools submit scores, some schools not. And where's the line? Like, oh, well, maybe they have like, a decent score in this section, but not quite so much in this section. And that's always where, how do I know when to submit scores and when not to?
Sure. So in test optional, and what test optional should mean, Alex alluded to the fact that many schools have used test optional. I think we're getting better as we go on about refining these terms of test flexible, test optional, and test blind. But what test optional does mean, it's worth more, and I define it this way, and hopefully it is true in most cases, is that not submitting a score does not harm your application. Right? So the same way that an optional arts portfolio or an optional interview, you should not be at a disadvantage if you don't submit that optional material. Not submitting your score should not put you at a disadvantage. That said, a strong score can only help, right? The question becomes, what is a strong score? And especially for what schools you're applying to. So I think, especially kind of stepping out of my official role at Swarthmore, but into the kind of like Janet perspective, I think I recommend students to really look at that middle 50% of a test score range if it's posted. And consider if their scores fall in the middle 50%, in that top 75 or the top 75%. So within the middle 50% or in the range above that. And those are typically scores that are strong for an institution. Of course, you can't, and hopefully admissions decisions are not being made on any one factor, right? So, but that's definitely a range to look at. I think that, with schools that have gone test optional, we sometimes see that those middle 50% ranges have been a little bit inflated from what might be strong in our process. So again, to Alex's point, that's a great question to ask an institution. Admissions offices can't always provide concrete advice on whether or not to submit a component of their application. So you can always email to ask, what does this, what does your office recommend? You might get an answer. They might say, we can't provide you specific advice on your application. But I think in that counseling role, that's what I would counsel individual students on, is in that range or above.
It looks like we have a question. Peter, did you have a question? You have your hand raised.
Yeah. She halfway answered it. I found that a lot of the selective colleges are pretty discreet about whether or not a student should, an applicant should submit their scores, which is obviously doesn't help us that much. But also, if you're looking at the mid 50% range, do you also take into consideration, you said you also take into consideration the context. So if a student is from a low performing school in a rural area with limited resources, sometimes I would, for example, this is just hypothetical. Let's say I have a student applying to Swarthmore and he or she has a 1200 or 1250 on the SAT, and the average or mean in the area is like 900. Do you submit or not? I know you can't. I know there's a lot factors go into that, but that's kind of the conundrum that I've had from time to time.
That's a great question. I can speak to Swarthmore and to similar admissions processes, as in those being holistic and contextual, where we are able to really consider all factors in an application and read any specific piece of information within the context. So I think on the one hand, because we're reading in context, that score, I think if a student chooses to submit that score, providing the context, whether that's a teacher recommendation letter, a counselor recommendation letter, the student can provide some context in their additional information section, but it's always really helpful to hear that from our, professional colleagues in the field, whether that's a teacher, a counselor, a CBO counselor. So I think that submitting that score with the context helps us understand that this is a student who is out, they are a superstar. They're doing really well. They are outperforming, right? What that context is. So I think in that case, that is absolutely the conversation my colleagues and I have all the time. And I never jump to any conclusions when I see a score because we're looking for that context. And so even, whether it's a strong score or a lower score in the kind of ranges, we're always looking for context to help us understand the situation. Because you could also have a student with a 1600 where the average is a 900, right? Or a 1450 where the average is a 900. And that might be a strong score that's in a middle 50% or really strong. But that context is still really valuable to us to understand that the average might be a 900. So I'd say if a student chooses to submit absolutely with context, I think, again, stepping back into kind of my Janet shoes, I think my recommendation there would be consider if you are if that score in its context demonstrates that you are really doing, that you are outstanding and doing great work and outperforming. I guess you don't have to be outperforming context, right? But that you are challenging yourself academically and you are succeeding in that academic context for your context. So I know that that's a non-answer, but I think that I would say that in that case, in most cases, I want to say that that would be something that we see as a benefit and a contributive part to a student's academic story. The challenge is when that context is missing, so you want to make sure that it's there. I can't give you a promise in every situation.
Right. No, thank you. It's just, I've also seen some students that get 700s and apply to all these selective schools, and I kind of think, well, I don't know. I don't. I mean, obviously, it's you don't submit a 700, but at the same time, maybe you should have some options in the, less selective
Yeah.
field, I guess.
And
Okay,
you're,
all right.
you're right that highly selective institutions can be really discreet about these things. Yeah, so I want to acknowledge that. You are right. That is difficult. I empathize with that aspect of this conversation.
Okay, thank you.
All right, next question. What, if any, and this may not, it may apply to some schools and not others. What, if any, are the implications for consideration for institutional scholarships if a student decides not to submit test scores?
Great question. And I would say this is going to vary from institution to institution depending on their own policies. I have seen a lot of institutions that have adopted test optional policies where the test scores are still required for certain scholarships. At Michigan State University, we do not consider test scores for any part of internal admissions awards. However, we do have a number of endowed or institutional awards outside of the admissions office that students can be considered for that do still take test scores into account because that is at the discretion of the funder. So there are still opportunities out there for those scholarships. Again, something I would encourage a student to research when they're applying to a specific institution and make sure that they're making that distinction about admissions merit awards and then institutional awards that may be outside of the admissions office that they could be eligible for, whether those are departmental or endowed awards from donors, and making sure that they submit the appropriate documentation for those and where they need to submit that documentation.
All right, next question. How might a student's decision to submit or not submit test scores impact their eligibility for select programs such as nursing, engineering, et cetera? I think this is going to be a similar answer, but.
This will definitely depend on the school, but for Swarthmore, none of our programs have testing requirements.
So at Kent, some of our programs do require testing requirements or a comparable GPA that would place them into that. So for example, our nursing program would go test score or GPA requirement. However, one of our programs that we are known for is our flight program. That program has a GPA requirement, but then there's actually an additional exam that is not an ACT or an SAT. It is an admissions exam called the Casper exam that students, if they meet the initial GPA requirement for that program, then are given access to that Casper exam, which then determine if they're eligible to start flight school. So that's an additional layer that we have for that selective program.
And at Michigan State, our initial admission process is that we admit to the institution, and we do not have any program-specific admission processes that we do when students are actually applying to us. So most of our programs that are going to have a secondary admission process, so if we're looking at something like nursing or engineering are two of the more popular ones, they do not have a testing requirement. They are focused primarily on the coursework that the student is doing while they are on campus with us at Michigan State, and less on what the student has achieved while they've been in high school, because we do have that context that we can work off of. The only program that we have on our campus that currently does direct to major admit is our Broad College of Business, which is one of our most popular programs when it comes to applications. Our Broad College of Business does not include the test score as part of their consideration. So if a student has applied test optional, they will be considered in such a way. Broad has other aspects of the application that they're paying attention to consider students for that direct admit pathway. The only program I think on the campus where we do know that there is a benefit to having a test score, especially a higher test score, would be into our honors program. So any student that applies to Michigan State University is automatically considered for a spot in our honors college, and our honors college is by invitation only. We use a test optional admission process to examine students for admission into that program. But I believe Janet mentioned this earlier about about one of the qualities is a high test score can certainly help in that process. The lack of a test score doesn't necessarily hurt, but the high test score does provide us with another admission factor to consider within the honors college. So for example, with our honors college students, we are normally looking for a student to have somewhere in that 1400 plus range. And we would tell a student that if you are in that 1400 plus range, you should submit that test score because we want to make sure that our honors college can get their eyes on that test score along with your academic coursework, because it just gives them another piece of showing your academic excellence. But if you're below that level, don't submit that test score, because then we want to put the focus on the academic work that you've done outside of the testing. So you're dictating a little bit of where we put our emphasis. So we do try to emphasize that with the honors program very specifically on our campus.
All right. And this is a question that I have sometimes from students when it's gotten a little bit better, but certainly those couple COVID years, if they're saying, oh, I'm mostly looking at test optional schools, or I'm only looking at test optional schools, should they still take the SAT or ACT?
I really like this question because I think that it gets at some of the thinking that institutions have. And this is not the only reason to be test optional, but it's certainly part of the conversation is, right? We are thinking about barriers to test taking. These tests can be expensive. They might be far away from you, especially in rural areas. Right? It may be that you don't get a PSAT day or a similar prep day from your school. So what I like to say for this question is if it is feasible for you to take that test, go ahead and take it, right? Because if you do great, if you get a score that you're proud of, that's strong, it can only help, as we've talked, Megan and Alex and I have talked about. And testing is another tool that may open opportunities for you or that may help you access those opportunities. Again, to Alex's point about the specific honors college at Michigan State University, having a strong test score might open that door. So I think for me, my advice comes in really into the point where if it's feasible, if you can financially afford it, if it is accessible to you, go ahead. It can only help. But if it's going to mean, having to take off time from work and your younger siblings don't have time to, don't have a caretaker, or you have to drive a really long ways, or you're choosing between, paying for groceries and paying for the SAT, then I think that it is great that you are taking advantage of these schools that aren't requiring you to kind of add that resource to your, or add that test to your application.
I would certainly agree. I think I would say that if the test is feasible, absolutely students should take it, especially if they're in a district that offers it to them during the school day exam. I certainly think there's not a ton of advantage to opting out of those types of practices, especially because there are going to be scholarships and awards that are outside the institutions that may require those types of test scores in order to be strongly considered for them. So I tell students that if you have access to the exam, even if you do not apply or plan to apply to institutions that require the test score from you, absolutely put one on file, because we want to make sure that we do have that as a resource if and when we need it. And I think Janet makes a wonderful point about the fact that if it's feasible, we certainly don't want students to put themselves in any financial harm by going out of their way to have a test score just on file when they don't plan to use it for their admission processes. I think that's a great thought process. But if you have access to an exam and can add that as part of your academic portfolio, we certainly would recommend that you do so.
One thing I would like to add on that too is also it helps us with the holistic side. So I've had some students, especially this year, where I haven't, like their English grades for some reason, freshman, sophomore year, are like, oh, what happened there? But then I look at their ACT or their SAT and the scores are really robust. And I can see in their statement, like, this is what happened. So, just as we sometimes, I'll say, turn into a villain our test scores, this is also where they can be beneficial when it's just maybe at a bad sophomore year, or even a junior year. Junior year is really critical. And maybe you take that ACT at the beginning of the senior year because good, that works for you. And it's like, look, I recovered. To show recovery, to show the things that sometimes maybe the classroom didn't get because you had an off year. I think that's also a way to look at it. Or maybe you hated geometry. I will say that geometry is math with shapes. I don't like the shape side of it, but you give me algebra and I'm going to do great. Give me all the statistics. So I think that's also a way for students who maybe just had a rough time with one particular class to show aptitude and skill set.
Yeah, I always look at it as another data point, and particularly for our rural students. Like we work with 23 partner high schools. We have students that have access to AP, IB, and everything else, and then we have students that, honors is the highest level that they have. So, it depends on the student, but a lot of times I'll say that's another piece of information that they can use. And I love that I'm hearing more from colleges that they contextualize it in terms of like comparing them to their peers rather than comparing them to, the general population of students taking those tests. Yeah. All right, this is next question. How might a student's decision not to submit test scores impact how they approach the rest of the application? And this is something I say, if you're not going to submit test scores, then we got to, make sure that essay is extra on point or whatever. What are your feelings there?
So for this, it does impact what we want to see in terms of a personal statement. We want their application to be more robust, is what I will say, especially if they're looking to explain their entirety of their academic profile. I want, and I'm just actually, this kind of goes either way, but I want a full application is the best way to describe it. This is our way of getting to know the student holistically. It doesn't have to be the most technical application in the world, by the way. I think sometimes students get caught up on this. I just want to know who you are. We want to know who you are as a person. When I do visits with students, I say, like, what do you want to do when you graduate? Like, if you were successful at Kent State University, how does that story end after you graduate? Get me to understand who you are. That's how they should be going through this. Like, college is just the beginning, but I also want to know how it would end for you, and your ideal ending. And for those students that maybe haven't had the ideal high school situation, share that information with us. Also, too, when students are filling out the application, it is okay to reach out to your admissions counselor to ask these questions that you're asking us now. So as they're looking at the application, it's okay to say, okay, I'm not sure if I should. Ask your admissions counselor, because they're happy to help. Their admissions counselors love to help. That's kind of the role.
I agree. And I think we've talked a little bit about, on several occasions, about several different topics, the idea of context and what you have the ability to do, especially if you're not going to provide a test score, is provide us with as much context as humanly possible. We're very, very lucky in this phase of college admission that we have access to a lot of contextual information about your school and about where you're participating that gives us a lot of information about who you are as a student. However, what we don't have is we don't have the information about you. So, for example, when we're reviewing an application at Michigan State, especially one that's test optional, we want to make sure then that we are focusing. We're obviously going to look at your academic record, and we're going to be looking for things like course rigor and whether or not you challenged yourself and your senior schedule, and making sure that we are seeing that academic challenge in your coursework. If we're not able to use the test score as a place to see that you have been able to achieve mastery within those subjects, we want to see that you're achieving it within the classroom. But even aside from the coursework piece, we also want to see what is happening with you in all those other areas. So we would encourage the student to make sure that they take the essay portion of the application seriously in addressing what are their plans, what are barriers that they've experienced, and what do they think are the building blocks for what have brought them to this point that they are in their academic career, so that we can try to understand that. Because I do think that even when we talk about how test optional is a net benefit for our students in a lot of ways, we also do know that we are sacrificing an important data point that we did have in previous times. Another area that I would tell students not to skip over is within their involvement in extracurricular activities. It tells us a lot about what the student's involvement in their school, in their community, and in their family. And we want to know as much about that as we possibly can, because again, we're trying to understand what are all of the factors that contribute to this student's academic success not just the GPA, not just the grades that they see on those exams. We want to make sure we understand it from a really broad perspective. So the student needs to take advantage of the opportunity to build the context for us that we have talked about so extensively, especially when we're not getting that additional data point that a test score can provide us and give us understanding of their achievement level.
I have two quick things to add. First is how Swarthmore would read an application without a test score. And I think similarly to what Megan mentioned, if we see, right, maybe someone has a little bit of a downward trend in one of their subjects, we might look to a subscore or to a test score if it's there, to give us some reassurance or to help us understand if this is maybe, right, it was a hard semester, it was a specific class, but see that a test score is strong or that a test score follows that trend, right? And maybe a student just isn't as in, they've struggled with a certain area. The context comes in with that they've struggled in a certain area. It can be helpful to have a teacher letter or a recommendation letter of any sort talking about how a student has sought help and advocated for themselves in that process. And then the second piece slipped my mind. But I think so for Swarthmore, right, we look to a test score to kind of as that extra data point, as Alex and Megan have mentioned. When we have a student without a test score, though, we're not looking for anything different or additional in their application. We're still looking for that complete picture. We're still looking at all those components, the essay, the recommendation letters, et cetera, as detailed as we would have. And so for us, there's not anything specific you can do to strengthen another component. I think the second piece I wanted to mention is talking a little bit more about what this context is. And Alex has talked about, providing some information from the student in their application. I think that context can be anything from making sure to include that someone works a part-time job in the activities list, right? I think that is becoming more of a conversation that work, family responsibilities, being involved in communities of faith, responsibilities, or a long commute are included in this area we're calling extracurriculars. It's not just your school clubs and activities. It can also be regional leadership, community involvement, anything like that. So I think in that bucket, we are starting to see more context as students are advised to include a broader range of activities and involvements in their activities list, which they should totally do. So we get context in those ways, but maybe even if a student doesn't have room to list that, mention that they had a part-time job in their first year. That can be in the additional information section or in a counselor, right, in a recommendation letter. Something even like how long it takes someone to get to school. Right? That can vary based on traffic, right? We have commutes of an hour or more in New York City, but we also see commutes of an hour or more, or maybe many fewer miles, but 45 minutes. Is a student taking the bus every day? Is that limiting their involvement in extracurriculars or to stay and get help in a homework group? Are they waiting at school and sitting in your office? Right? And one of my colleagues grew up for she didn't have a ride home, so she spent 3 hours every day between school ending and fencing practice in her guidance counseling office. So that is what we mean when it comes to context, these sorts of like how a student is engaging in school and where their time is spent, as well as family members that are ill or stressors when it comes to money, food, housing. Students should not feel pressured to share anything they're not comfortable sharing with us, but giving us these details to understand what a student is also managing and working with in their access to being in your class, being in a classroom, being at school, and kind of working on the academic section is all really helpful to us.
All right, thanks. We have about 20 minutes left, so we're going to open it up for questions from our audience. And we already have an excellent question actually related to context. How much do you depend on a high school's school profile to determine context? What information do you wish was on them? We had a whole learning lab on school profiles last year, but I don't know, it's a big question, but just if you could give us some points about what you expect to see on those.
I can start. I would say, first of all, go watch that learning lab if it was recorded. This is a big topic, and it's one of, I think, if it's kind of my passion project. If I could give a TED Talk to all partners on all sides of the college piece, I think it's really important. we look at school profiles to understand just the area, right? How big is your town, your county? How wide of an area does your school pull from? We are considering things like what classes are offered, especially for the group of student, the 4 years that this student was in your school, whether that's AP courses, IB courses, honors courses. The lack thereof is really helpful to note. Dual enrollment classes, a career technical center. Um, so we look to school profiles to get a sense of what students have access to in the number of courses and the requirements, to see what classes they've chosen to take. Things like if you have testing data, right? Average scores or percentiles in your area, percentages of free and reduced lunch or student, students, how far students commute, if you happen to have a lot of students that drive or a lot of students that can't drive. So helping us understand kind of the context of your region and your school is really helpful. I'll pause there and let others jump in because this is a long answer and there are many components.
Doesn't want to unmute me. I don't know if I think your answer, honestly, Janet, kind of like hit exactly what we're looking for. I don't know if Alex has anything to add.
I don't think that I would add anything specifically in terms of what we want to see. I think, Janet, you're hitting a lot of the big pieces in terms of what we want. I really think that oftentimes we use the school profile to understand the academic utilization. So when we think about what students are doing is when we're looking at their transcripts, we don't want to set those parameters of we need a student to take 7 AP courses if a school only offers 3. We want to try to understand what's available to the students. So I think that academic utilization is a huge piece of that. And then I also think that I would say for Michigan State, in a lot of context, we are actually not only utilizing the school profile, but we're also building our own understanding of the peers from your school that apply to Michigan State because we're trying to understand who the students are that are actually a part of that process. So we're also taking into account how those students' academics look compared to the other students applying from the school as well. So we have a little bit of our own profile development, but definitely academic utilization from the school profile tends to be the most impactful piece for us.
All right, and all right, this is several questions. If scores are visible on the transcript, how do you train readers not to consider them or maybe allow readers' impression of a student to be biased? That's a good question. I always wonder that. Like if they're there, are they blacked out before anybody sees them or yeah, how does that work?
Mm-hmm. So I think it depends on institutions. We redact as many as we can, and if we catch one, it also gets flagged for redaction. But yeah, there's all sorts of information that we don't end up using that also comes in with applications that vary. We're used to not using stuff that we see.
I would say we're right there. We do the training in that way, where one of the first things that we do is identify the student's preference, and we simply work with our counselors to ensure that that's not a part of their decision. There's a certain amount of bias training that we're doing within our reading process to make sure that our counselors and readers understand exactly what they're looking for and where that bias may drive them. But we do try to make sure that we just heavily train that if the student is elected not to use the score, even if it's present, it is their responsibility to exclude it from their consideration.
I could also mention we often see eighth grade grades on transcripts from various states, and we don't evaluate with grades from eighth grade. So that's another example of something that we learn to overlook or ignore.
All right, this question is related to QuestBridge, even though we know you don't work for QuestBridge, but do you know anything about the students listing both test optional and test required schools on their match list?
I can certainly get you an answer for this question. We are a QuestBridge partner school, and I read applications for QuestBridge as well as our other rounds. Um, at Swarthmore, likely, so I'm not certain. I should get you an answer, but to Alex's point, if a score were to come in on a QuestBridge application and the student has elected that they do not want us to evaluate with that test score, we will not evaluate with that test score. If I can put my email in here and I can try to find an answer if you want one. So send me an email and I can ask the person who, our staff member who deals more with QuestBridge.
Thanks. Anything that should be addressed around the ACT changing science reasoning to optional?
Nothing specifically for us at Michigan State. We've been working through that process, and we are not going to change the way that we're looking at composite scores. We see that most of the students that do apply to Michigan State do submit SAT scores, but for the students that do submit their ACT scores, we are not going to require the student to participate in the science portion of the exam. We are going to consider the composite score that is delivered by ACT, and if the student attaches a science score, we'll treat it just as we have with a writing score, where it is recommended but not required for our consideration.
Same at Kent.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just telling Alex it's the same thing at Kent. So, and that seems to be aligned with a lot of the other large publics as well that are still test optional.
All right, this is about context again. Dartmouth has been really open and direct about reviewing scores in context, but have you seen other colleges, maybe Ivies or other highly selectives, that have had strong messaging about how they're using test scores within context? And you talked about some of that, but I'm wondering if that too, is that becoming a trend that people are going to start saying, yes, we're, because it makes a difference in terms of whether or not those of us who work with students advise students to send scores or not send scores if we know that they're in, good scores in context of their school. But is that something that you're seeing amongst your colleagues?
I think not necessarily, I wouldn't speak to the idea that more and more schools are going to do this, but what I would say is that in the context of higher education in general, there is more and more pressure on institutions to provide transparency within these review processes and accountability and understanding for how we're moving through those processes. We've seen obviously court cases about a variety of things that have to do with the relation to the admission process. But I think in general, something that is being asked of institutions is you need to be able to explain to someone why they are not admitted within an institution. We are seeing that more and more. How forthcoming schools are going to be about how they exactly read and determine a student's application is going to vary from institution to institution, because there's no requirement for an institution to put that information out there. However, I do think that we are seeing, especially more large publics and state-funded institutions, being more transparent about the information that they are looking at when it comes to the application process. And a lot of that has to do with a demand for transparency from the public and from the government. So we're doing everything that we can to make sure that we keep up with that. I also think you'll find institutions in Michigan State, we really believe this, is that we believe that everything about our admission process should pass what I've always referred to as the New York Times test, which is if we wouldn't put it on the front page of the New York Times, we probably shouldn't be thinking that way in terms of admitting our students. So we try to make sure that our students do understand what context are we looking at their applications and how are we understanding them.
Even though I'm at a public, I've worked with our dual enrollment programs for a long time, and I actually use Yale's website as one to show students who are test optional, like their clarification. Like they have a good, I'll put a link to it, but it comes to the top of my mind when I think of a highly selective institution like Dartmouth that has very clear policies, or not, guidance is a better way to describe it, for how they are reviewing scores within context. I can put that link in the chat, but that's a good example of a highly selective institution that is very clear.
Okay. Also, some states are requiring students in public schools to take the SAT, less so the ACT, as a graduation requirement. Is there also consideration for how many times a student has taken the exam? Most take it once to check the box versus those who have a stronger test prep commitment.
So I can speak to Swarthmore. We So we do accept, right, we're test optional, but we will super score, which means that if a student has taken ACT or SAT on various dates, or they've taken it several times and they've scored higher on separate subsections on those various test dates, we will, as long as we receive all those scores, we will take the highest subsection scores and calculate those into a combined super scored total score. And so that is how multiple test dates factor into our process. We don't look at and are not trained to look at the number of times a student has taken an exam. If a student has taken, were it to come up that a student has taken the SAT 8 times, I would probably feel concerned for them and wonder kind of where that got, please, I hope students are not taking it multiple times. I know students are sometimes counseled to take it, see how you do, take it again if this, practice and take it again. So we're not making any considerations based on the number of times a student has taken an exam.
So we don't super score. So we're just going to take your highest composite from one. What I will say when we think about the multiple times, and Ohio is a school that requires the ACT we're getting better as a state. We're giving options now, but we always look at too like the time, especially if a student took it multiple times. Like, did they take an exam at the beginning of their junior year? And we know in our state, if they took it in March, they very likely took it at the school. And so, but if we see a student that took it beginning of junior year, okay, that student was probably they were aggressive and are maybe looking at some more selective schools, and then we see them take it in June, or March. In March, they took their free date, didn't like the score, and then when we see them take it in the fall, like there's a pattern that we have noticed it's okay too, I say, if a student took that exam in March and then takes it again in the fall, because some students, there's a lot of pressure around that spring date junior year, and they're just not in a place necessarily to pay attention. We also know that April and March are like very test heavy months for students, and every student is different with how they take exams. And so there's a lot of pressure that comes along with that. So it's my long way of saying, as long as the student is doing what's best for them, we're not really judging. I mean, we're evaluating their composite score if a student wants us to use the exam, but we very rarely see a student that's taken it 4, 5, 6 times. Now, again, for dual enrollment purposes, that is where I will say I've seen actually quite a few students take, because we require them to be college ready, and if they don't meet the GPA requirement, I've seen a student as a junior take the SAT twice, the ACT twice for that purpose. And again, we know that. Oh, this student was clearly trying to take dual enrollment classes and needed the score to get in.
To Megan's excellent point, we do note the test date, right? So if there's a weaker score maybe, but it was taken really early, we will take that into consideration.
Yes, if we're considering a student's test scores because they've asked us to and sent us multiple, we will try to consider the trend. If we need to, that would be probably used very sparingly in terms of their academic trend. But generally speaking, we do not penalize the student for having taken it more than once. We're going to consider their highest score as our baseline consideration for where they are. And we would generally tell a student that, again, if it's feasible for them to retake the test and they have schools on their list that are requiring test scores for them, or they're looking for certain scholarships or programs, if you have the ability to take the test multiple times, we would encourage you to do so. But we wouldn't hold that against a student in our review.
All right, we're in our last 5 minutes. Any other questions? No more questions in the chat right now. Anybody has a question for our panelists before we close out? All right, I want to say thank you to Alex and Janet and Megan for helping to put this together. Some great information. We hope that you have a wonderful summer. We will be getting the recording out to you. But a few takeaways, this is a very nuanced process, and context matters. And for those of you who write recommendation letters, I think it's on our shoulders to provide that context for our friends in admissions. So again, thanks everyone for coming. Have a wonderful summer.
Shall we
start
end the
removing
recording?
people at the end. Oh, yes, thank you.